Who is next in line to become the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Today, this is not a difficult question. It is well understood that whoever is the next most senior apostle to the current church president will be the next president, should he live long enough. The singular issue is seniority. It all boils down to seniority. So what determines seniority among the apostles? Again, today there is a ready answer to this question, but it was not always so. In fact, in today's episode of Church History Matters, we walk through the winding path of how criteria for seniority in the apostleship has changed significantly from Joseph Smith's day to our own. And we'll talk about how church presidents have responded to difficult seniority questions, such as, if two men are ordained apostles on the same day, who's the senior apostle? And if a man is ordained an apostle but never becomes a member of the Quorum of the 12, how does this affect his seniority? Or say two men were ordained apostles, the one sometime before the other, but then the man ordained second becomes a member of the Quorum of the 12 ahead of the man ordained before him. Which of these two men has seniority over the other? And how, if at all, is a man's seniority affected if he is an apostle who leaves the church or is excommunicated for a time, but is then reinstated back into the Quorum of the 12? While these may seem like very technical questions, they grew out of real-life circumstances, and the decisions made about each scenario have determined more than once who has become president of the church. I'm Scott Woodward, and my co-host is Casey Griffiths. And today, Casey and I dive into our 5th episode in this series about succession in the presidency. And by the way, please excuse my microphone issues. For some reason, my mic kept cutting and dipping out and making it sound like I was underwater. Oh well, what do you do? Now let's get into it.
Hey, if you're listening to this episode on the day it came out, we are at Education Week.
Yes.
And so if you want to meet us in person, Scott and I are doing a series together, and then I'm doing a solo series.
Yeah.
But Scott and I will be together in the Wilkinson Center ballroom. So
Yes. Come on over and say hi if you're in town. We'd love to see you.
come on down and see us. Wilkinson Center Ballroom, 1:50 to 2:45, Tuesday through Friday. And so come on down.
This is our idea of a good time.
Yeah. Speaking of our idea of a good time, I'm just going to warn you in advance that this is the episode of our series on succession that is like the wonkiest. Like, you know how you see those guys on the West Wing and other TV shows that are just like obsessed with the minutia of every single law?
Uh-huh.
This is that episode. And so if you like technicalities, if you want to get into the absolute tiniest details of how things work, this is what it's all about. When it comes to succession, this is very technical stuff, but I find it fascinating personally. Like,
It is very fascinating.
this is stuff I'm excited to talk about because I love kind of like the technicalities and how they resolved all these little issues.
Little issues which have big implications and big consequences, actually. So
Yeah.
that I think makes it very, very worth our discussion today. So absolutely, man.
Let me give a little introduction. So
Uh-huh.
last time we talked a little bit about how what happened in the wake of Joseph Smith's death established a couple things. The senior member of the Quorum of the 12 was going to take over leadership. That's Brigham Young. The apostles, the Quorum of the 12, also have 3 years where they lead the church, the apostolic interregnum, as it's called.
Apostolic interregnum. And I looked up the word interregnum. It means a gap
A gap.
or discontinuity between normal forms of government. There you go.
Yeah. And that still happens in the church today. Today, it normally takes around 2 weeks. Back then, it was 3 years. It wasn't until the winter of 1847 they decided to reorganize the first presidency after a spirited debate among the members of the Quorum of the 12.
It was not without controversy itself.
Yeah. And at that time, it was really clear who the senior apostle was. It was Brigham Young.
Yeah.
However, the question of seniority and how we determine seniority raises a number of additional questions as well. For instance, what determines seniority? And if apostles are called at the same time, how do you figure out who the senior apostle is? So I'll give you an example. 2 apostles are called in the 1940s. One is named Ezra Taft Benson. One is named Spencer W. Kimball. They both become presidents of the church later on, but how did they figure out which one was senior?
Yeah.
Because they were called at the same time.
Yeah.
And since seniority is such a big question in determining the leader of the church, how do we decide today who the senior apostle is? You remember back in 2015 and in 2018, by the way. In 2015, we had 3 apostles called at the same conference.
That's right.
2018, we had 2 apostles, Ulysses Suarez and Garrett Gong. Elder Gong is senior. How did they figure out who the senior apostle was going to be? And the reason why this is such a big deal is when we talk about succession, this literally determines who the president of the church is going to be.
Yeah.
And let me illustrate this with a more authoritative voice than my own.
Okay.
Back in 1998, Gordon B. Hinckley, president of the church, appeared on the talk show Larry King Live.
I remember this.
You remember this? Were you a missionary when this happened? Or
I was a senior in high school.
Okay, I was a missionary, and this was like the Super Bowl. Like we went to a member's house, we got permission to watch it. They had treats, we brought investigators,
little hot wings and ranch dip,
Totinos, pizza rolls, all that stuff.
Totally.
And it was huge because the president of the church was going on this talk show. First of all, Larry King was known as a good interviewer, but people could also call in and ask him questions. At the time, Larry King, who rest in peace, he's gone to the other side, so is President Hinckley, was married to a Latter-day Saint. He was married to a member of the church.
That's right.
Within the first minute, Scott, Larry King asked President Hinckley how he became the prophet, and President Hinckley gave what I think is still the best short response I've ever heard. So, Can I play this clip for you right now?
Yeah, let's play it.
This is CNN.
Tonight, a rare live interview with Gordon B. Hinckley, president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Next on Larry King Live. He's one of the distinguished religious leaders in the world. It's an honor to have him as our guest tonight for the full hour. Later we'll be including your phone calls. He's Gordon Hinckley. Gordon B. Hinckley is president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormons. He is 88 and a half years old.
Correct.
Do you think like maybe retiring?
Oh, no, there's no chance. Got to keep going right to the end.
You're going to go till the calling comes.
Right.
What does the president entail? I've heard you called a prophet. Are you when you speak, do you speak for the church?
I speak for the church, yes, I think so. Yes.
And this is a position that you're appointed. How do you get this? How do you get to be president?
You're appointed a member of the Council of 12, and you outlive everybody else. The senior member of the 12 becomes the president of the church.
The council takes turns.
Right.
That's the best short answer for succession. What we are taking probably like a 15-episode series to explain, President Hinckley did in less than 5 seconds.
You become ordained a member of the 12, and you outlive everybody else.
That's it. Yep. So easy peasy. Thanks for joining us on Church History Matters. Have a great week. That's it.
Yeah. So that's super easy for us to say, super easy for President Hinckley to say, but things were not always so cut and dry, were they, Casey?
No, definitely not.
We got to that point after some angst and some rearranging. So, yeah, it's a nice, smooth place to be today. But we want to talk about, in today's episode, how further steps were taken by President Brigham Young to get us to that easy answer. It's because it wasn't always that easy.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. So that's what we're dealing with today, seniority in the 12 and how it's determined.
Okay. So our burning question of the day is, how did Brigham Young's method of determining seniority in the 12 impact the church going forward? That's what we want to do.
Correct.
Okay, so how do you want to start this one? Should we go back to 1835 at the beginning of the 12 and then string it forward from there?
Yeah, so let's talk about the original Quorum of the 12, okay?
Yeah.
The original Quorum of the 12 was something that was kind of in the mix before the church was even organized.
Yeah.
A revelation given in 1829 to Joseph Smith. This is Doctrine and Covenants 18. It was a revelation given to Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer. And in verses 37 to 39, they were told they were going to search out the 12. In fact, it reads, "And now, behold, I give unto you Oliver Cowdery, and also unto David Whitmer, that you shall search out the 12, who shall have the desires of which I have spoken. And by their desires and their works you shall know them. And when you have found them, you shall show these things unto them." And so Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer are going to find the 12. They're two of the original three witnesses of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
By the time we get to 1835, when we're ready to set apart the 12, which is 6 years later, Martin Harris is in the mix too. He's one of the three witnesses. So the three witnesses choose 12 men among the elders of the church.
Okay.
And this is just after Zion's camp, just after the church has been through some traumatic events. And Joseph Smith has on his mind things like, hey, are we training leaders to take over? What if something were to happen to me? He almost dies while he's on Zion's camp.
Yeah.
And so he knows he needs to call the 12. He receives another revelation. This is section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants, setting up the presiding quorums of the first presidency, presiding bishopric, 12, 70, stake high councils, and so on and so forth. And the three witnesses are asked to choose the 12. But here's the question. They're all going to be chosen at the same time. So who's going to be senior? Like, how do you determine who the quorum president is going to be? And Scott, you already know the answer, but how did they determine seniority among the original 1835 12 apostles?
Yeah, so they go with the most literal meaning of the term seniority, and that is they go by your birthday.
Yeah.
That was the original way. That's not the way we do it today, but that was the original way with the members of the original Quorum of the 12.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, they were all called at the same time.
Yeah.
They weren't all set apart on the same day, but it was within a few weeks of each other.
Yeah, and they almost, it's weird because some of them were traveling.
Yeah.
But they almost went in reverse order. Like they were ordained almost opposite to their age. Like Lyman Johnson, who's the youngest in the quorum, was actually the first one ordained.
Yeah.
And you can put out all these dates here and it goes down. But by seniority, in the original Quorum of the 12, they were listed as follows. The original president of the Quorum of 12 was not Brigham Young. It was Thomas B. Marsh. I should be at TMU right now if things had worked out.
Thomas Marsh University.
Yeah.
And you're not at Thomas Marsh University because
Thomas, well, we'll get to that part of the story later on. But Thomas B. Marsh is the original president of the Quorum of the 12 because of age. Then David W. Patton, then Brigham Young is next. Brigham Young's third in seniority.
Yeah.
Then you got Heber C. Kimball, Orson Hyde, William E. McClellan, Parley P. Pratt, Luke S. Johnson, William B. Smith, Orson Pratt, John F. Boynton, and Lyman E. Johnson. So that's the original Quorum of the 12, arranged by seniority.
And we should say that they're fairly young.
They are.
They're fairly young. Thomas B. Marsh was 36 years old, and he's the oldest in the quorum.
Yeah.
In 1835. Brigham Young was 35. The youngest, all the way down to Lyman Johnson, he was 25 years old. So, I mean, we're talking a pretty young quorum, very different than church members are used to seeing today.
These whippersnappers, right?
Whippersnappers. Yeah.
They're even young compared to me and you, Scott.
I know.
And it's a little overwhelming. But
yeah,
I mean, this is fair, right? Age is fair. It doesn't favor anybody over anybody else.
It's logical.
And they're just using the literal meaning of the word seniority.
Yeah.
However, as historians are wont to do, and I told you this was a really nitpicky episode, as time has gone on, we have found some complexities in this story. So
a few wrinkles, if you will.
Let me point out a couple, okay? For instance, Oliver Cowdery, who's selecting the apostles, actually wrote a letter to Brigham Young in 1848 telling him that the three witnesses had originally chosen his brother Phineas as a member of the quorum.
That would be Brigham Young's younger brother, correct?
This is Brigham Young's older brother.
Older brother. This is Brigham Young's older brother. Okay.
Big brother. And that's important because if Phineas had been placed in the Quorum of the 12 because of his birthday, he would have been the senior apostle.
You would be at PYU.
I would be at PYU.
You would be at PYU. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily as BYU, but yeah.
It's objectively funnier than BYU, right? But yeah, Phineas's birthday was February 16th, 1799. He would have been the oldest member of the quorum.
So he's older than Thomas B. Marsh.
He's old. Yeah, he would have been the senior apostle.
Why was he not? Why was he not? If the three witnesses chose him, why was he not put into the quorum?
Let me just say this. Phineas was a great guy.
Yeah.
And I think he would have made a great apostle and probably a great church president. We'll never know. This is all Monday morning quarterbacking.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, Phineas stays faithful.
Yeah.
He's Oliver Cowdery's brother-in-law. He helps bring Oliver Cowdery back into the church. There's a whole fabulous series of letters between Phineas and Oliver while Oliver's outside the church, where Oliver affirms the reality of priesthood restoration and the miracles that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Phineas later explained that Joseph Smith actually approached him. Joseph Smith approached him and asked if he would be willing to serve elsewhere so that Joseph's brother, William Smith, could serve in the 12. And Phineas agreed to step aside.
Whoa. Let's just think about that for a second. So William Smith is put into the 12 at Joseph Smith's own instigation, where he gently asked Phineas, who had been chosen by the 3 witnesses, to step aside and to serve elsewhere.
Yeah.
That's going to have a church history trajectory altering impact, right?
Yeah. So William Smith does become a member of the Quorum of the 12, but of the original 12, he struggles quite a bit.
Yeah, he's got the most problems.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say he has the most problems.
A lot of them have a lot of problems.
A lot of them get excommunicated fairly quickly, like by 1838.
Yeah.
William hangs in there until 1845, and we've already talked about what happened with him.
Yeah.
But William's troubled. Phineas is stable and faithful. William was a gifted speaker, but he has a complicated relationship with Joseph Smith. We've talked about this in the past. By the way, Oliver Cowdery tells this to Brigham Young. In an interview near the end of his life, David Whitmer actually says the same thing, that like they had chosen Phineas Young to serve in the 12, but were overruled by Joseph Smith. And it doesn't seem like there were hard feelings here or anything like that. Joseph Smith's president of the church.
And Joseph is clearly the presiding elder. You can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Phineas Young, you and I could be at PYU if there had been just a little different.
Yeah.
The second wrinkle in the story is concerning their age. According to the ages that they provided at the time, Thomas B. Marsh was the oldest. He was born November 1st, 1799, and David Patton was the next oldest, born November 14th, 1799. So there's only 13 days that separate them.
Wow.
But Thomas becomes the senior apostle, president of the Quorum of the 12.
Yeah.
However, when we reviewed census records, birth records from Massachusetts, where Thomas B. Marsh is from, we found out that Thomas actually misremembered the year that he was born. He was not born in 1799. He was born in 1800, the next year, which would have put him even further down in the order of succession.
So wait, he forgot his birth year.
Yeah.
I feel like 1800 is a nice round number. Like, how do you accidentally think that I think it was 1799?
I mean, apparently this wasn't super uncommon at the time. I did do a little research into this, and a lot of people, it wasn't like today where we have this rigid calendar system. Time was seasonal. That's why, when Joseph Smith writes the first vision, he has to actually sit down and say, oh, what year was it? And everything like that.
Yeah. That's true.
But David Patton was actually older. So you and I should be teaching it DPU.
DPU. If it wasn't for the fact of what happens to David Patton.
Yeah, so David Patton could have been, and all this is kind of illustrating, they start out with this question of seniority, but already there's challenges regarding that. And the 12 is, in a lot of ways, a meritocracy, where they start out all together, but as time goes on, the best, the most faithful, the most gifted leaders do kind of sort of sift themselves to the top, if that makes sense.
You're saying in terms of staying in the church?
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of staying in the church, I would agree with that. Because, in that original Quorum of the 12, we're going to lose a bunch in the midst of and in the aftermath of the Kirtland apostasy, correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, and the other wrinkle here too is if we set aside seniority by age and go by when they were ordained, which is another metric to consider, they were almost ordained in reverse order. Like we mentioned, Lyman Johnson was ordained first.
Yeah.
Thomas B. Marsh was ordained second to last. You could make the case that if seniority went by who became apostle first, Lyman White might have been the senior apostle. So it gets a little twisty there too.
In the midst of the Kirtland apostasy, we're going to lose 4, right? John F. Boynton, Luke S. Johnson, Lyman E. Johnson, and William E. McClellan.
Yes.
All in the year 1838, officially.
They're all excommunicated from the church. And Luke Johnson does come back into the church, but he's never placed back into the Quorum of the 12.
Luke Johnson's the only one to ever be an apostle who was later ordained a bishop in Utah, actually. Kind of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good credentials. Good credentials.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this on multiple occasions, but this was during the Kirtland Apostasy, which was pretty severe.
Yep.
Thomas B. Marsh, David Patton. Brigham Young later says that only him and Heber C. Kimball didn't quarrel with Joseph Smith, didn't question his leadership.
The way Joseph says it is only Brigham and Heber didn't lift the hill against me.
Yeah, that's right.
Which doesn't mean they all apostatized. It just, every one of the apostles had some issues with Joseph during this time, except for Brigham and Heber.
Yeah. So in some sense, it is a meritocracy, right? They all start together, but as time goes on, these four are excommunicated from the church. A revelation given July 8th, 1838, this is Doctrine and Covenants 118, calls new apostles to replace these four lost apostles. The revelation reads, "Let my servant John Taylor, and also my servant John E. Page, and also my servant Wilford Woodruff, and also my servant Willard Richards, be appointed to fill the places of those who have fallen and be officially notified of their appointment." So they're all called at the same time. Again, how are we going to determine seniority? There's a couple wrinkles here too. For instance, it takes time to call each of them to the apostleship because Willard Richards is actually in England.
Yeah.
He goes with the first set of missionaries to England in 1837, and he stays behind to oversee and minister to the church there.
Mm-hmm.
And he's actually the first apostle ordained on foreign soil. He's ordained in England. I've been to England, and to English members of the church, this is a point of pride. Willard Richards was actually ordained in England, and he meets his wife there, Janetta Richards.
Mm-hmm. And in that verse, I count 2 future presidents of the church.
Yeah.
John Taylor, John Page, Wilford Woodruff, Willard Richards. Yeah, this is a big move. This is a very significant moment.
We know how the story turned out, but does their calling affect their seniority in the 12? How come John Taylor became president of the church after Brigham Young and not Wilford Woodruff if they're called at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
Like, all these questions are coming up, and you can see how from the beginning it's complex, and they have to start laying down some rules. However, before these four could even be set apart, ordained apostles, new developments happen. So Orson Hyde and Thomas B. Marsh, both original members of the Quorum of the 12, apostatize. They leave the church.
Yeah.
And we'll talk more in depth about that in a second. David Patton is killed at the Battle of Crooked River. So we have our first apostolic martyr of this dispensation. All of this happens in October 1838, before the four can be ordained to the presidency. So
now Thomas B. Marsh gone.
Thomas B. Marsh is gone.
David Patton's gone.
David Patton's gone. Seniority shifts to Brigham Young. And Brigham Young immediately steps up to the plate. He leads the saints in their exodus from Missouri.
Yeah.
And a couple weeks later, he ordains John E. Page and John Taylor, both on December 19th, 1838. Johnny Page was ordained first. So keep that in mind.
Okay.
We've already lost 4 apostles to excommunication. Now we've had 2 apostatize, 1 get killed. We're missing 7 members of the Quorum of the 12.
Wow.
We've replaced 2.
Okay.
So while the first presidency, that's Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Sidney Rigdon, are in Liberty Jail, they send a letter to Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball on January 16th, 1839, and they ask them to call 2 new apostles to replace Orson, Hyde, and Thomas B. Marsh. The letter, which you can find on the Joseph Smith Paper site, reads, "It will be necessary for you to get the 12 together, ordain such as have not been ordained," so they're recognizing some of them haven't even been ordained yet, like Willard Richards and Wilford Woodruff, "or at least such of them as you can get to proceed to regulate the elders as the Lord may give you wisdom. We nominate George A. Smith and Lyman Sherman to take the place of Orson Hyde and Thomas B. Marsh. Brethren, fear not, but be strong in the Lord and the power of his might."
Can I tell the Lyman Sherman story?
Yeah, please, fire away.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So George A. Smith is Joseph Smith's cousin, and Lyman Sherman, he's a stalwart who's mentioned in D&C 108. But a fun little plot twist here is Lyman Sherman passes away the next month. The next month, Casey.
Yeah.
He was informed, as I understand it, of his nomination to the 12, but then he passed away. In the meantime, through the efforts of Heber C. Kimball and Hiram Smith, they're going to bring Orson Hyde back into the church.
Yeah.
And since his replacement, Lyman Sherman, had passed away, Orson Hyde will just be able to assume his place back in the Quorum of the 12. Like a really interesting turn of events right there.
Yeah. And that's just one little wrinkle. So
Yes.
in the meantime, Wilford Woodruff and George J. Smith are both ordained on April 26, 1839. You might recall that was when the 12 snuck back into Far West.
Such a fun story.
Section 118 says they have to start their mission from Far West on the 26th of April, 1839. Far West becomes enemy territory.
Yeah.
They sneak in, they ordain these two. They even excommunicate a couple people.
Yeah.
And then they get the heck out of town as
Mhm.
fast as they can. Now they fully restore the quorum when they get to England, and Willard Richards is ordained and Lyman White joins the quorum too.
So now everything is fully fleshed out. We've got a full quorum of the 12.
Yeah, for the most part, by this point, this is the quorum of the 12 that's going to be in place when Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith are killed.
Yeah.
And that step up and lead the church. There's a little bit of a hiccup because Orson Pratt's excommunicated, but he comes back into the church. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
But these are the 12 that assume church leadership. In fact, the 12 in order of seniority, when Brigham Young gives that speech where he's transfigured, where the people sustain him.
8th of August, 1844.
Yeah. So the 12 at this time are Brigham Young,
Mhm.
Heber C. Kimball, Orson Hyde, Parley P. Pratt, William Smith, Orson Pratt, Johnny Page, Willard Richards, Wilford Woodruff, John Taylor, George A. Smith, and Lyman White.
Okay.
There's complications after this. For instance, Johnny Page, who you'll remember was ordained before John Taylor, takes off and follows James Strang and is excommunicated. Lyman White takes off and sets up his own colony in Texas in 1848. Although he does stay in contact with members of the Quorum of the 12. Like as late as 1856, they're still writing him saying, come back. But Lyman dies before he can come back.
For a brief moment, we've got full quorum of the 12.
Mhm.
And then 1846, we lose Johnny Page. 1848, we lose Lyman White. Oh, and William Smith was excommunicated in 1845.
1845. Yeah, we forgot about him.
Okay. So that's where things land kind of in Nauvoo before we come across the plains.
Yeah.
Essentially. So in all of this, you keep calling it wrinkles. In all of these wrinkles, then these little twists and turns among the original 12, this is going to raise a few more questions about seniority, right?
Right.
Like for instance, okay, so was seniority determined by when the call was given or by when the person was ordained? And what about a person like Orson Hyde who left the church, or Orson Pratt who leaves the church or was excommunicated or wasn't? We'll talk about the complexity there. What about that little wrinkle? How does that affect their seniority when they eventually come back to the 12? So many questions.
Yeah, and big questions, because when we get to the second succession, when Brigham Young passes away in 1877,
Yeah.
if we're going by seniority within the 1835 12, John Taylor is not the senior apostle. Orson Hyde is.
Right.
And spoiler alert, John Taylor becomes president of the church.
Not Orson Hyde.
But the question is, why not Orson Hyde
Yes.
if we're going by seniority? So let's pause for a second and consider the story of Orson Hyde and then Orson Pratt. So tell us a little bit about Orson Hyde.
So from 1839 to 1877, Brigham Young is leading the church. Heber C. Kimball is next in seniority. He'll serve as a counselor to the first presidency until his death in 1868. And because of this, Orson Hyde will serve as acting president of the Quorum of the 12 from 1848 all the way till 1875.
Mm-hmm.
But then in 1875, Brigham Young's going to hold a meeting to realign seniority with the 12. And why does he do this, Casey? I will tell you.
It's a story.
It's a story. Get comfortable. The story goes all the way back to 1838. Now, Orson Hyde is among the first missionaries to serve in Great Britain. When he comes back from that mission to Great Britain, he comes to Far West. He's feverish. He's exhausted. According to his biographer, Myrtle Hyde, she argues that in this diminished physical condition, he falls under the sway of Thomas B. Marsh. Now, Thomas B. Marsh had been his file leader in the Quorum of the 12, right? So, but now in this kind of weakened physical state, his biographer suggests, he became disillusioned under Thomas B. Marsh's influence. We all remember the story of Thomas B. Marsh, his wife, the cream strippings, him leaving the church, but it's more complicated than just that. So that's already happened at this point, right? So now he's out of the church.
Mm-hmm.
So in October of 1838, when Far West is about to come under the siege by the Missouri militia, Thomas B. Marsh persuades Orson to leave Far West with him. And so they travel to Richmond Landing, which is a safer town about 45 miles south. And there they run into Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, who both of them at this time have been excommunicated from the church. And those three together persuade Orson to help them compose a public statement alleging that Joseph Smith intended to attack and conquer part of Missouri and beyond by violent means. Jeez. Orson adds his own statement to the document. He supports its claims, and then he adds that he had left the church. So he wasn't actually excommunicated. He just publicly announces here he left the church.
He announces he's leaving the church. Yeah.
Yeah. So while they're in Richmond Landing, word reaches Thomas and Orson that David Patton, their fellow apostle, had just been killed in the Battle of Crooked River. And Thomas B. Marsh and David Patton had been really tight. They were very close, and so this news was a blow to them. And a few days later, Orson Hyde and Thomas B. Marsh are sitting together in a local little cabin on a log, if I remember the story right, when suddenly Thomas sat up like someone had slapped him on the shoulder. And Orson Hyde actually heard a voice, not Thomas's voice, some voice coming from somewhere say, "Thomas, Thomas, why have you so soon forgotten?" Orson's like, "What the heck was that?" Thomas tells Orson Hyde that he believes that was David Patton, who had just visited them from beyond the veil, because he, Thomas, and Elder Patton had made a covenant to each other to remain true and faithful to the end. And now Thomas is out of the church, and David Patton comes back from the other side of the veil and gives him a little slap and tells him, "What the heck, man? Why have you forgotten our covenant?"
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting is that experience doesn't affect Thomas B. Marsh as much as it affects Orson Hyde.
Orson Hyde, yeah.
Yeah. Sometime after that event, Orson actually receives a vision where he learned that he said, quote, "If I did not make immediate restitution to the Quorum of the 12, I would be cut off from the church and everlasting blessings with all of my posterity." That vision also revealed that he would be cast among the satanic hosts because of his spiritual denial, whatever that means. I think he even thought he might become a son of perdition.
Yeah, I bring this up when people bring up sons of perdition, that
Mhm.
whatever Orson Hyde saw here not only got him to rejoin the church, but he volunteered to go on a 7,000-mile mission
Yeah.
to dedicate the Holy Land. Like it really, he had a come to Jesus moment,
Yeah.
if you will.
Literally, yeah.
Where he really came together. Yeah.
This spurred him deeply spiritually. And so Orson leaves his new home and travels to Richmond Jail, where he meets with Parley P. Pratt. He tries to see Joseph and Hiram in Liberty Jail, but he was barred from entering. But he eventually makes his way back to Far West, where he finds Heber C. Kimball in the wreckage of that city in the aftermath of the expulsion there. Heber was his old missionary companion in England, and they reconcile quickly, easily. Heber welcomes him back. Orson asks Heber if he thinks that there's any way he could be accepted back into the church. Heber thought he would. When Lyman Sherman died, remember that was Orson Hyde's replacement in the 12.
Mm-hmm.
When he passes away before he could be ordained, both Orson Hyde and Heber C. Kimball took that as a sign that the Lord wanted Orson to resume his place back in the 12. And you can just kind of stop and think about that for a second. That's super interesting if that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
So a few months later, Orson is going to be reunited with Joseph and Hiram when they get out of Liberty Jail in Quincy, Illinois, and Brigham Young will be there as well. And there they hold a little council, and the decision is made not to excommunicate Orson Hyde. But he had publicly left the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was that dynamic happening here.
He didn't get rebaptized because he was never officially excommunicated, but he had made a public statement that he'd left the church.
So he hadn't officially been excommunicated, but he stated he left the church, and therefore there was no need to rebaptize him. Very interesting. And as you mentioned, then later he's going to serve the mission to dedicate the Holy Land. He's going to publish one of the earliest accounts of the first vision in German. I mean, he's going to be on the forefront from here on out.
Yeah.
He'll be in the meeting that sustains the vote to reconstitute the first presidency in Canesville.
Yeah, he's the one that calls for the sustaining vote in Canesville, yeah.
So that's kind of his little cycle, quote unquote, out of the church and then back in, even though he wasn't technically excommunicated. But the question lingers, how does his time, quote unquote, outside of the church affect his seniority in the 12 apostles?
Yeah.
Because there had been another man called to replace him in the 12, Lyman Sherman, which is Joseph Smith acknowledging that Orson Hyde is not in the 12 anymore, right?
Yeah.
So there's that really interesting wrinkle. So anyway, we'll pause it right there. That's the Orson Hyde story and the little bit of complexity that's going to come around a little bit later in terms of reorganizing seniority in the 12.
Okay. The second person that has a complicated past in the Quorum of the 12 is Orson Pratt. This one's even twistier,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, it is.
Here's what happens. Orson Pratt was excommunicated, but the legality of his excommunication is questioned by no less a figure than Joseph Smith.
Tell us the story.
So here's the story. 12 go on their mission to England. While they're in England, Joseph Smith introduces plural marriage in Nauvoo.
Yeah.
When Orson gets back to Nauvoo for a couple months, everything's going great. He's doing good stuff like he always does. When Orson's wife, Sarah Pratt, made an accusation that Joseph Smith had approached her and asked if she would be sealed to him.
Whoa.
And so this kind of blows up Orson Pratt's world, and he sides with his wife, basically.
And Joseph Smith, when he was interrogated about that, he denies it, correct?
He denies it, but the story's going to get more complicated. So
Yeah.
Fasten your seatbelt. During this time, Orson stops associating with other members of the 12. He refuses to join the Masonic fraternity, which they all do. And he doesn't join the Quorum of the Anointed, which we've talked about as this group that the temple ordinances are introduced among.
Yeah.
And apparently he's going back and forth. He's hearing different things, that Sarah was associated with John C. Bennett, who's being excommunicated from the church during this time. And it finally reaches a fever pitch when Orson leaves this note. Somebody literally finds this note in the street in Nauvoo.
Mm-hmm.
The note's written by Orson Pratt. Somebody finds this.
Okay.
He writes, "I am a ruined man. My future prospects are blasted. The testimony upon both sides seems to be equal, the one in direct contradiction to the other. How to decide, I know not, neither does it matter, for let it be either way, my temporal happiness is gone in this world. If the testimonies of my wife and others are true, then I have been deceived for 12 years past. My hopes are blasted and gone, as it were, in a moment. My long toils and labors have been in vain. If, on the other hand, the other testimonies are true, then my family are ruined forever. Where, then, is my hope in this world? It is gone, gone, not to be recovered. O God, why is it thus with me? My sorrows are greater than I can bear. Where I am henceforth, it matters not." And then he goes missing.
Oh, geez. So on the one hand, his wife is adamant that Joseph Smith proposed to her. On the other hand, Joseph Smith is adamant that he did not.
Yeah.
And Orson's saying the evidence on both sides seems to be equal, and they contradict each other totally.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter who's right or who's wrong.
I'm ruined either way.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So, man, Orson goes missing, and the whole city kind of turns out to try and find him.
Ooh.
Some people have speculated he may have been suicidal. Orson's family members, who have the most at stake here, don't think that he was. They just think he was
Wandering.
He was struggling, right?
Yeah.
They find him downriver about 5 miles, and they bring him back to the city. And a few days later, there's another public confrontation where they have a public meeting to consider John C. Bennett, who has been seducing women in Nauvoo under his doctrine of spiritual wifery. Like,
Right.
it's not a plural marriage. It's you're my spiritual wife, which means we have to sleep together. They hold a public meeting to sustain Joseph Smith, and Orson votes against Joseph Smith, which in a public meeting would have been a huge thing.
The gossip shockwaves a rippling.
Yeah. And Joseph directly confronts Orson in the meeting. He says, "Have you personally a knowledge of any immoral act in me towards the female sex or in any other way?" And Orson responds, "Personally toward the female sex, I have not."
Mm.
But they have this public confrontation. So now it's out in the air. Everybody knows Orson is troubled. The accusations are spreading around Nauvoo.
Yeah.
The other members of the Quorum of the 12 try to intervene. Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and George A. Smith go and meet with him. Brigham Young later writes, "I spent several days laboring with Orson Pratt, whose mind had become so darkened by the influence and statements of his wife that he came out in rebellion against Joseph, refusing to believe his testimony or obey his counsel. He said he would believe his wife in preference to the prophet. Joseph told him if he did believe his wife and follow her suggestions, he would go to hell."
Jeez.
And so, it's just tough.
I'm trying to remember what Brian Hill said about this. We think that this was potentially a John C. Bennett concoction. Is that right? Because he had been, it turns out, with Orson Pratt's wife, right?
Yeah.
And that this may have been a ruse concocted by John C. Bennett to try to get Orson and the 12 to turn against Joseph or something like that. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, this is how John Taylor describes it later on. It's linked to plural marriage, but it's also linked to John C. Bennett and his immoralities.
Yeah.
John Taylor says Orson had some difficulties arising out of the introduction of the celestial order of marriage. it seems from remarks made in conversation that I had with him afterwards that he did not fully realize or comprehend the situation. When I saw that he was very severely tried, I talked to him for nearly 2 hours to prevent, if possible, his apostasy. And so while all this stuff is going on, Joseph is unable to talk to Orson himself directly either because he has to go into hiding. This is after the failed assassination attempt on Lilburn Boggs. And so the apostles are trying to work with him because Joseph can't. When they realize that Orson is kind of going the other direction, they reach out to Joseph, and Joseph actually says that they should ordain a mass Lyman to take his place in the 12.
Yeah.
So it sounds like in Joseph Smith's mind, he's out of the 12. And acting upon that idea that we're going to replace him, these three apostles, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and George J. Smith, excommunicate him on August 20th, 1842. So there is an official excommunication that happens here. However, in the weeks that follow, this is where the plot twist happens. At least 3 different people come forward and say that Sarah was involved with John C. Bennett, not Joseph Smith.
This is Orson's wife.
Yeah, that they had seen Sarah Pratt and John C. Bennett in kind of compromising situations, and that what was happening was she was actually having an affair with John C. Bennett. Now, Wilford Woodruff, during this time, writes in his journal, John C. Bennett was the ruin of Orson Pratt. So this is kind of the machinations of John C. Bennett to wreck their marriage.
Why would Sarah go along with that and say that Joseph Smith came to her? Like that is just painful.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that's happening here too.
Yeah. Like what?
Well, in September, so he's excommunicated, but only 3 apostles are there in August. In September, Orson publishes a statement in the Wasp, that's the Nauvoo newspaper run by William Smith, and he denies that he had, quote, renounced the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and says, I believe that its doctrine, which has been published extensively in both America and Europe, is pure, according to the scriptures of eternal truth. There is something in it which seems to whisper that God is there. The luster of truth cannot be dimmed by the shadows of error or falsehood. Neither will the petty difficulties existing in its votaries weaken its influence or destroy its power. So he publicly comes back and says, I haven't denied that I think the church is true. I still believe the doctrine of the church comes from God.
Yeah.
But there's wiggle room there to say, but I'm suspicious of the prophet.
He calls that petty difficulties existing amongst us.
Yeah, so he's faithful to the gospel during this time, but he has these challenges. What sort of makes him turn the corner is that John C. Bennett, who now has been kicked out of Nauvoo, begins to make really violent statements. Like he even says he would drink the heart's blood. That's the direct quote of those who had expelled him from Nauvoo. And during this time, John C. Bennett actually reaches out to Orson and Sarah and wants to enlist them in this plot to kidnap Joseph Smith and take him to Missouri.
John C. Bennett's the worst.
Yeah. So in response to this, Orson Pratt actually takes the letter to Joseph Smith and publishes another excerpt in the Wasp where he says, Dr. John C. Bennett had declared that he'd received a letter from me and from my wife that we were preparing to leave and expose Mormonism. I wish, through the medium of your paper, to say to the public that said statements are entirely false. We have never at any time written any letter or letters to Dr. John C. Bennett on any subject whatever. Neither are we preparing to leave and expose Mormonism, but intend to make Nauvoo our residence and Mormonism our motto.
So John C. Bennett had claimed that Orson and Sarah were leaving the church.
Yeah.
And they were getting ready to expose Mormonism. He had published that.
Yeah, and this incident sort of causes Joseph Smith and Orson Pratt to reconcile. So a little bit after this, in January 1843, Joseph Smith calls the 12 together and he tells them that, quote, Orson had confessed his sins and manifested a deep repentance. And then when they bring up Orson's excommunication, Joseph Smith actually says, well, there was only 3 of you. There has to be a majority of the quorum, which is at least 7 of the apostles, for the excommunication to be efficacious. So that's a major question, too, is was Orson Pratt actually excommunicated?
So Joseph says the excommunication was not legal in that fullest sense.
Yeah. We have the minutes of this meeting. Brigham Young actually asked about Amasa Lyman taking Orson Pratt's place in the 12.
Because that had already been done at this point, right? They'd already ordained him?
Yeah, he'd been ordained, but again, only by 3 apostles. So Joseph Smith actually says, well, that was valid, but do you have an issue bringing Orson back into the 12? You could be an apostle and not be a member of the 12.
Right, so Joseph says it was valid, but Brigham says, so what about bringing Orson back into the 12?
Yeah. And Joseph says, I think you should do it. And then there's actually some tough stuff. Like Joseph Smith tells Orson directly, I never proposed to Sarah. And then he actually tells Orson, he counsels him to get a divorce from Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
But then he also says, according to the minutes, if you do not do this, I shall never throw it in your teeth. In other words, I'm not going to criticize you if you decide to stay with her. He gives him a blessing and says, quote, I prophesy in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ that it will not be 6 months before you have things that will make you glad you have not left us. Orson, the latter part of your life shall be more joyful than the former. And then Joseph Smith actually announces that Amasa Lyman is going to be brought into the first presidency. So he tries to get Amasa Lyman to take Sidney Rigdon's place in the first presidency instead, which we've talked about in previous episodes.
Wait. So does Orson Pratt divorce Sarah?
Eventually, yeah. Decades later, they do. And Sarah leaves the church. And Orson, in the later part of his life, says he does believe that Sarah was unfaithful to him.
Ooh.
Sarah writes an expose where she repeats the claim that Joseph Smith had proposed to her, but even that document's questionable. We don't think she wrote it because in 2 places she's referred to as Mrs. Orson Hyde, which is an error that it feels like she probably wouldn't have made. And so Orson later on in his life thinks that she was unfaithful. She says that Joseph Smith had proposed to her. Joseph Smith openly says, I did not. And that day in Nauvoo, the day the whole meeting of the Quorum takes place, Orson and Sarah are both rebaptized again. It's January. They get rebaptized in the Mississippi River.
Not because they were excommunicated.
Not because they were excommunicated. Back then, a rebaptism could just be I'm recommitting to the faith.
Mm-hmm.
I'm moving into a new period of my life, basically. So
literally renewing your baptismal covenant.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is another wrinkle. Like, was Orson actually excommunicated? 3 apostles did excommunicate him and the ordained replacement in the 12. How does that affect his seniority in the 12?
Okay.
The 2 Orsons have these 2 questions kind of lingering over their seniority within the 12.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so during Brigham Young's presidency, he's also going to deal with other questions about seniority.
Yeah.
For instance, seniority in the original 12 is determined by age, as we said. But Brigham Young in 1861 will clarify that seniority should be determined by the date of ordination.
Mm-hmm.
And now this causes a significant change because Wilford Woodruff was seen as senior to John Taylor because John was 20 months younger than Wilford.
Mm-hmm.
However, John had been ordained 3 months before Wilford, so he was now advanced before Wilford Woodruff in seniority. So it seems like Brigham Young appears to have been looking to the future where if these questions were not resolved now, they might cause conflict later.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he says that he spoke of it now, quote, because the time would come when a dispute might arise about it. So that's something interesting. So 1861, mark that date. Then another wrinkle in the story comes from the fact that during this time, at least 6 other people are ordained apostles, but they're never placed in the quorum of the 12 apostles for various reasons. And this might be a new concept to a lot of people that you could actually be ordained an apostle, but not serve in the 12.
Yeah, the title is Apostle at Large, which has got to be the coolest title I've ever heard. And we have had an example of an apostle at large as late as the 1970s. Alvin Dyer was the last one.
Yeah.
But most people just assume you're made an apostle.
Yeah.
And you join the Quorum of the 12. That's not always been the case. In fact, let me walk you through a couple of these.
Yeah, tell us about these 6 apostles at large.
Okay, so the 6 apostles at large. Jedediah Grant. This is the father of Heber J. Grant.
Uh-huh.
He's ordained an apostle by Brigham Young in April 1854 to join the first presidency.
Mm-hmm.
He serves in the first presidency. He's an apostle, but he dies in 1856, and he's never formally inducted into the Quorum of the 12. There's an example. He's ordained an apostle so he can serve in the first presidency.
Got it.
John Willard Young, this is one of Brigham Young's sons, is ordained an apostle on February 22nd, 1855. He acts as an assistant to Brigham Young in the first presidency, but he's never brought into the Quorum of the 12.
Mm-hmm.
And after Brigham Young's death, he's sustained as a counselor to the 12.
Mm-hmm.
But he's released from that calling in 1891, passes away in 1924. So you've got technically an apostle at large running around for 30 some odd years without an attachment to the 12.
Wow.
Daniel Hanmer Wells. This is Daniel H. Wells. He's ordained an apostle January 4th, 1857, and he goes into the first presidency to replace Jedediah Grant when he passes away.
Yeah.
He's made a counselor to the 12 when Brigham Young passes away, but he's never brought into the quorum either.
Yeah, this is the position we don't hear about today, being a counselor to the 12.
Yeah. Joseph Angel Young. This is another one of Brigham Young's sons. He's ordained an apostle on February 4th, 1864. He's never made a member of the first presidency or the 12, and he passes away on August 5th, 1875. Brigham Young Jr. These are the last two that actually caused some of the controversy. Brigham Young Jr. is ordained an apostle by Brigham Young on February 4th, 1864. 4 years later, he's brought into the Quorum of the 12. He passes away on April 11th, 1903.
He does become a member of the 12.
Yeah, but there's a 4-year gap from his ordination to him being formally brought into the 12. The last one is a person you might have heard of named Joseph F. Smith.
I have heard of him.
Joseph F. Smith is ordained an apostle by Brigham Young July 1st, 1866, so after Brigham Young Jr., but he's brought into the 12 in 1867 before Brigham Young Jr. He serves in the first presidency as a counselor and later as president of the church from 1901 to 1918.
The wrinkle here could be between Brigham Young Jr. and Joseph F. Smith in terms of who should be the president.
Yeah, Brigham Young Jr. is ordained an apostle first, but Joseph F. Smith is brought into the Quorum of the 12 first. So is it your ordination or are you being brought into the Quorum of the 12? Remember, Gordon B. Hinckley said you're made a member of the Quorum of the 12 and then you outlive everybody else. So
but that was not yet established. So Brigham Young doesn't think that being an apostle automatically means you're part of the Quorum of the 12, clearly.
Yeah.
In fact, he even says that once. He says, because a man is ordained an apostle, it does not prove that he belongs to the Quorum of the apostles.
Yeah.
So that's, again, kind of a foreign concept to a lot of members of the church today.
Yeah.
But, scripturally, I think there's a precedent here. There's a lot of scholars who believe that Paul the apostle was not a member of the Quorum of the 12 apostles. He's called to be an apostle, an apostolos, one who's sent out, called by Christ to be a witness of him, but may have not served in the 12, which is, again, an interesting precedent there.
So we got a wrinkle here, right?
Yeah. Walk us through the wrinkle.
In the October 1868 General Conference, Joseph F. Smith is listed before Brigham Young Jr., but in the April 1869 conference, just 6 months later, Brigham Young Jr. is listed as senior to Joseph F. Smith.
Oh, geez.
Most of the next few decades, Joseph F. is in the first presidency, so it doesn't come up a whole lot. Brigham Young Jr. stays in the Quorum of the 12.
But the question remains, who is senior?
Who's senior? There's this ticking time bomb, and they know that they're going to have to solve it eventually because nobody knows which one of these two guys is senior. So it's not resolved until 1900. The first presidency, now it's led by Lorenzo Snow. Lorenzo Snow actually sits the first presidency and Quorum of the 12 down and has a discussion. In fact, Joseph F. Smith, who has a major stake in this, records the meeting. He said, "We met with 11 apostles and partook of the sacrament. Brigham Young Jr. blessed the emblems. It was unanimously decided that acceptance of a member into the council or the Quorum of the 12 fixed his rank or position in the apostleship. The apostles took precedence from the date they entered the quorum. The ordination to the apostleship under the hands of any apostle, other than to fill a vacancy in the quorum and authorized by the general authorities of the church, did not count in precedence." So
mark 1900 as the year that begins to establish what President Hinckley told Larry King.
Yeah.
You join the 12 and then you outlive everybody else.
Yeah.
So it's about joining the 12, not being ordained an apostle.
Yeah. And Joseph S. Smith records this. Like, he writes out the rule we still follow today. If the first presidency were dissolved by the death of the president, his counselors, having been ordained apostles in the Quorum of the 12, would resume their places in the quorum, according to the seniority of their ordinations into that quorum. This important ruling settles a long unsettled point and is most timely, and it really was timely. Because within the next year, Lorenzo Snow is getting close to death. George Buchanan, who's actually next in seniority, passes away, and Joseph F. Smith becomes president of the church from 1901 to 1918 when Lorenzo Snow passes away. Brigham Young Jr., who to his everlasting credit was in the meeting and apparently unanimously sustained this decision, passes away in 1903. We got Joseph F. as president of the church for 17 years instead of Brigham Young Jr. for 2. And that has to do with them humbly sitting down, discussing, and then deciding the final issue unanimously.
That is really interesting. So we could have had another Brigham Young as president of the church had this not been worked out the way it was worked out.
Yeah, we've had 3 Joseph Smiths. We could have had 2
That's true.
Brigham Youngs if they hadn't sat down and kind of worked this out. So again, these are technicalities, but you can see how interesting they are, right?
They're consequential technicalities.
Yeah, you get ordained an apostle, you're not brought into the Quorum of the 12. How does that affect your seniority? Gordon B. Hinckley says you get brought into the Quorum of the 12 and you outlive everybody else.
Bam.
Now, we're going to go back to something we talked about earlier, the fate of the 2 Orsons.
The 2 Orsons.
Yeah, so let's talk about that.
Okay, so you've got apostles at large,
Mm-hmm.
quorum seniority. These are 2 questions Brigham Young is dealing with during his tenure. By far the most vexing of the questions comes from the Orson problem. Can we call it that?
The Orsons, yep.
The Orsons quandary. The brief estrangement of Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt from the church and from the Quorum of the 12. Okay, so Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt's past struggles are now going to raise a few questions about seniority in the 12. Both have technically left the church, maybe. Maybe that's too strong.
Maybe, sort of.
Orson Hyde technically left the church. Orson Pratt was excommunicated, but then apparently wasn't. It was kind of overridden there by Joseph Smith because there wasn't a full quorum to do it, etc. So their past is a little tenuous here. Their past relationship with the church and with the Quorum of the 12. They both were accepted back fully into the Quorum of the 12 without question.
Yeah.
Except for this question. How does that affect their seniority? So, according to John Taylor, it was George A. Smith, one of Brigham's counselors at the time, that raised the question about the status of the 2 Orsons. And John Taylor says that he had been aware of the correctness of George A. Smith's position here and had been for years, but had chosen not to bring up any question of that kind. John said that he personally cared nothing about the matter and moreover entertained a very high esteem for both the parties named, both Orsons. But at the same time, John Taylor recognized that complications might hereafter arise unless this matter was adjusted. And this is, by the way, this is going to affect John Taylor directly, right?
He's next. Yeah.
He's next. If it's not the Orsons, then it's him. And so if they go under him, he's the next president of the church. If they're above him, then he's not. So Brigham Young may also have been hesitant to address this matter, and he could have adjusted their seniority back in 1861 when he adjusted the John Taylor Wilford Woodruff seniority situation, but he didn't. Strangely, this matter wasn't brought up by church leaders, but by a reporter, actually. They're the ones that agitate this question in none less a publication than the Salt Lake Tribune, Casey, which at that time was pretty much an anti-Mormon newspaper.
Yeah.
And they raised this question in 1871 in an article entitled The 2 Orsons and the Question of Succession.
Which, by the way, is a killer title for an article.
Maybe that'll be the title for our episode.
Maybe.
The reporter wrote that nothing but an extraordinary act of legislation of his quorum, sustained by the voice of the entire church, could displace Orson Hyde, and that would amount to a grand impeachment, he says. But the reporter also praises Orson Pratt, saying, the best part of Mormon theology has been derived after Joseph Smith from Parley and Orson Pratt. Orson was also the master of nearly all the Utah Protestants and of all the thinkers and rebels of Mormonism. But today, they have outgrown their teacher, being younger and consequently more progressive. But Orson's disciples still venerate their old master, whose example they are following in measuring intellects with Brigham Young and refusing to be subdued by the absolute will and mind of any mortal man. Wow, close quote. So the question is raised initially in 1871 by a newspaper reporter there, kind of publicly here.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's brought to the fore in the councils of the church in 1874 after Brigham Young becomes gravely ill. And anytime the senior apostle becomes gravely ill, the question of succession, no doubt, weighs heavily on the mind.
Mm-hmm.
So that next year, Brigham Young reorganizes seniority in the quorum one more time. According to George Q. Cannon, quote, not long before Brigham Young's death, a number of the 12 and leading elders were in San Pete County, when in the presence of the congregation in the meeting house, he, Brigham Young, turned to President John Taylor and said, here is the man whose right it is to preside over the council in my absence, he being the senior apostle. And John Taylor actually writes about this moment. He said, Brigham Young brought up the subject of seniority and then stated that John Taylor was the man that stood next to him, and that where he was not, John Taylor presides. He also made the statement that Brother Hyde and Brother Pratt were not in their right positions in the quorum, close quote. So what seems to be resolved at this point, and is articulated even more clearly after his death, is that Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt were to be relegated beneath John Taylor, because here's the phrase they use: John Taylor held the oldest ordination without interruption of any man among the apostles. There it is.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, shortly after Brigham Young's death, George Q. Cannon announces in the October 1877 General Conference that Brigham Young had been, quote, moved upon to place John Taylor ahead of two others, the two Orsons, until by the unanimous voice of the apostles, he, John Taylor, was acknowledged the senior apostle, holding the oldest ordination without interruption of any man among the apostles. There's the catch: without interruption, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here the rule now becomes established that seniority is determined by longest continuous service in the Quorum of the 12. And that's why John Taylor becomes the new president of the church, not Orson Hyde and not Orson Pratt. And he'll serve from 1877 to 1887 for a decade. Really interesting turn of events, Casey.
Yeah. And there's all kinds of opinions out there on why Brigham Young made this move. The cynical argument made by some historians was that he didn't like Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt. He criticizes Orson Hyde once very publicly. This is in the 1850s.
Mm-hmm.
And Orson Pratt, as we've talked about, kind of saw his role as, the questioner.
Yeah.
When Brigham Young brought up something, Orson Pratt a lot of times would question it.
They were sparring buddies in a sense.
They were sparring buddies.
Yeah.
They also praise each other. They work closely together.
Yeah.
I think that might be a little cynical, to be honest with you.
To say that this is Brigham Young's last jab at the two Orsons.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard people say that. I don't think the evidence substantiates that, do you?
I don't think so either. Now, there's the practical argument that you could just say Brigham Young was getting up in years, and so was Orson Hyde, and so was Orson Pratt. Orson Hyde passes away the year after Brigham Young does.
Mm.
So he would have only been president of the church for 1 year.
Yeah.
And Orson Pratt passes away in 1881. So he would have only been president of the church for 4 years.
Yeah.
So you could argue it from that practical matter, but I prefer to take the faith-filled approach to say Brigham Young was moved upon by the voice of inspiration. In fact, B.H. Roberts, this captures my feeling. Okay, he said, in those changes made under the direction of President Young, by which Elder Taylor was assigned his proper place in the quorum of the apostles, may we not discern the inspiration of God, preparing the way for the man whom the Lord designated to succeed to the leadership of his people when President Young should be called home.
Mm.
I see that. I mean, the 1877 to 1887 is some of the most difficult times in the history of the church. It's when the anti-polygamy crusade and the kind of conflict with the federal government in the United States kicks into high gear.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just really grateful that John Taylor was the guy that was leading the church during this time, because it was rough, really rough.
Brutal.
And John Taylor withstood the test. Like he was the right person for the right time, which is how I feel about every president of the church, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I also want to point out, you and I were talking before this, and the question was, did Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt ever speak out against this? Did they act upset?
Were they bitter, angry, upset? Yeah.
To their credit, when I was prepping this outline, I couldn't find anything where they did.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when John Taylor moved to reorganize the first presidency 3 years later, Orson Hyde's gone by then. But Orson Pratt actually spoke in favor, was very influential in getting the other Quorum of the 12 members together to reorganize the first presidency. So these guys are heroes,
And to us, it seems like, well, doesn't that just operate really smoothly anyway? Don't we just get a new first presidency? But that process was not yet smoothed by this point. In fact, there were some members of the Quorum who dissented at that suggestion that there be a reorganization of the first presidency for various reasons.
Yeah.
And so you see Orson Pratt here as peacemaker and reconciler, trying to bring the Quorum members together to sustain a new first presidency.
Yeah. In fact, let me read a statement. This is from Orson Pratt. When they're having this discussion on if they should reorganize the first presidency,
Mm-hmm.
he says, every time we, the 12, and he's the only remaining original member of the 1835 12.
Good point.
He says, every time the 12 thought upon the subject of organizing the church, we saw that one council, the most important of all, was still vacant, the first presidency. Could we ignore it? No. We therefore consider the propriety of organizing it at the present conference, and Brother John Taylor, by the voice of his brethren the 12, being the person holding the legal right to that office, was selected to occupy the position of the president of the whole church.
He's a team player here all the way to the end.
Yeah. And I mean, this is real humility, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
he has his conflicts and he has his issues and his ups and downs. But man alive, Brigham Young at one point said, if you chopped up Brother Orson into 1-inch parts, every part would cry out that Mormonism was now true.
Yeah.
Scott, you and I have both been to Orson Pratt's grave in the Salt Lake Cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
You know what he has chiseled into his headstone.
My body now sleeps, but my testimony lives and shall endure forever.
Yeah. What a guy.
That was a lot, Casey. So let me synthesize this into a final few points.
Yeah.
So, by the death of Brigham Young in 1877, several important questions about succession have now been resolved. Namely, 1, the senior apostle becomes the president of the church.
Mm-hmm.
The first presidency can now be reorganized. Number 2, in addition here, Brigham Young sets the precedent that seniority is now determined by when a person was ordained into the 12, and that seniority is based on continuous service in the Quorum of the 12. 2 important points.
Yeah.
And then
The Orsons rule, we'll call it. Yeah.
the Orsons rule. And then 3rd point, actually a little bit later after Brigham Young's presidency, during Lorenzo Snow's presidency, church leaders resolved the question about apostles at large, determining that it was not their ordination as an apostle, but rather entrance into the Quorum of the 12 that would then determine their seniority. Those I think are established during or shortly after the Brigham Young presidency, which still is how things operate today.
Yeah, so we're gradually having the rules of succession revealed to us, but other questions still linger.
There's another question? Oh, geez, Casey. Okay.
Yeah, so we've still got a couple of things to work out. For instance, when Brigham Young dies, John Taylor doesn't immediately reorganize the first presidency because there's not agreement. That precedent wasn't fully set as part of succession.
Meaning what?
Meaning they hadn't figured out yet that they should just reorganize the first presidency right away.
Mm-hmm.
There's a 3-year gap after Joseph Smith's death before Brigham Young reorganizes the first presidency, 3-year gap after Brigham Young's death.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also a gap after John Taylor's death, too, before they get together and I'll get on board with reorganizing the first presidency.
That's not fully ironed out yet. Okay.
However, that's not the most serious thing. The most serious thing is still this question of, does the senior apostle become the church president?
I thought that was established.
It feels like that's set in stone. But in our next episode, we're going to talk about a person who one historian says gives the most serious challenge to the question of succession by senior apostle. And I'm pretty sure that that person's identity is going to surprise you.
Cliffhanger.
We're going to leave it there. Until next week, stay tuned.
Woo. Can't wait. Thank you for listening to this episode of Church History Matters. Next week, Casey and I discuss the last time in our history when an apostle seriously challenged the idea that the most senior apostle would become the next church president. And we'll talk about how this issue was finally settled once and for all. If you're enjoying Church History Matters, we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate, review, and comment on the podcast. That makes us easier to find. Today's episode was produced by Scott Woodward and edited by Nick Galletti and Scott Woodward, with show notes and transcript by Gabe Davis. Church History Matters is a podcast of Scripture Central, a nonprofit which exists to help build enduring faith in Jesus Christ by making Latter-day Saints Scripture and church history accessible, comprehensible, and defensible to people everywhere. For more resources to enhance your gospel study, go to scripturecentral.org, where everything is available for free because of the generous donations of people like you. And while we try very hard to be historically and doctrinally accurate in what we say on this podcast, please remember that all views expressed in this and every episode are our views alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of Scripture Central or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thank you so much for being a part of this with us.